Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of Classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality. Today's episode is a conversation, and I'm speaking with Mark Davis, whom I've known for nearly 30 years, going back to my ashram days in India and upstate New York. Mark is the founder of Hypno-CBT, where CBT stands for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And this is a science-based therapeutic model he's developed over the last 20 years. He has trained close to 3,000 practitioners, more than 1,000 of which are now certified in his method. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine. The college he runs is influenced by Stoic philosophy, Kashmir Shaivism, and CBT. In this conversation, we explore the contemplative and practical roots of his work. We discuss stilling the mind, agency, self-objectification, disinhibition, and the pragmatist reading of Abhinavagupta. We also refer to some genuinely practical techniques along the way. What we didn't get to in this conversation is Mark's core competence, that is, hypnotherapy. This is a significant omission which will be corrected in a future conversation, because Mark has a unique view of hypnosis as exemplifying the innate divine capacity to reimagine manifestation, with therapeutic practice as the method of dehypnotizing back to that source. So I'm hoping to invite him back for a second conversation soon on exactly that. Because Mark claims Hypno-CBT is strongly grounded in Abhinavagupta's cognitive philosophy. Still, this was a great first conversation with this accomplished and intelligent man. I especially appreciate his evidence-based approach. Hope you too find it interesting. I'm here with Mark Davis, who I've known for many years. Mark, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
You're so very welcome. It's great to be here and to be able to be part of this incredible piece of work you're doing. How many years do you think we've known each other?
I don't know, but probably at least from the mid-90s. So what does that make it? 30 years?
Yeah, maybe 30 years. 30 years. I can certainly think of early 2000s.
Yeah.
But, in upstate New York.
Yeah. So let's start, not right at the beginning, but let's start from what was the impact of your exposure to the teachings of Kashmir Shaivism or Tantric Shaivism, though you and I both knew it by the former name back then, and how did that contribute to your journey? And a little bit about that journey from then to now, and how you became expert in what you're expert in now, and how those teachings are something that have informed your development and the development of what you teach, and also perhaps somewhat have become a sounding board that you react to. Anyway, that's a broad scope.
That's a broad scope. Yeah.
Starting back then.
So my first contact with what I'm going to call Kashmir Shaivism, because that's what I'm familiar with, and that's how it first came to me, was in the bookstore of Gurudev Siddhapit Ashram in Ganeshpuri, India, where I had gone in 1986. I went for 3 months and stayed for 6 months, and then I went back sometime later and stayed for. I've spent a total of 5 years in full time in Ganeshpuri, what we call familiarly Ganeshpuri Gurudev Siddhapit Ashram, which is the ashram of Guru Mai, who's my teacher. And so when I was there, and we can talk more about how I got there if we want, but when I was there, everybody would spend a lot of time like waiting for darshan with Guru Mai in the courtyard, and that would be the thing they went to. And I was, I didn't like to sit there the whole time for like an hour just watching her. I'd be a bit like, I like to read the scriptures. So I went to the bookstore and I bought one of the books, and it was Shiva Sutras by Jayadeva Singh, and published by Motilal Banarsidass, and I have got that very copy at my bedside table right now, and I was just opening the other day, and I began to read that, and it's quite, the first time you dive into it, even his introduction is actually really good, but even then, just even the introduction, the concepts, the ideas, is pretty high level stuff if you've not been introduced to this before. But I began to feel this buzz of energy, and it was like consciousness was reading herself or recognizing herself somehow in the text. And I would just get, whether could I understand it, I would just get stoned. I would get thoroughly stoned sitting there and very blissed out reading it. Then I'd come back again and read it again. And again, I'd just kind of get stoned. My mind would stop and I'd just be in this feeling of sort of bliss, or just, I would call it thick Shakti. And it was such that if somebody else was sitting next to me, they would feel it too. And they'd go, wow, I'm getting really stoned. Or they'd go, wow, the veils of reality suddenly feel really thin. And so this was my first contact, was reading, trying to struggle and read the Shiva Sutras, Jayadeva Singh's, particularly his introduction, which I think is just really so helpful. I've read it so many times. And then go through the first, 9 sutras, and then start the second ones. And that was my introduction. And I built out my whole, his whole conceptual structure, not his, but the whole structure there of the tattvas, levels of speech, etc. And fundamentally, most importantly, probably of the upayas. I got there, and that experience of the mind being stopped by the scripture has been one of my fundamental practices. Probably that's continued. I will pick up and read until, and it doesn't take long before I just feel stillness arising, the breath stops, and then I'm extremely bad at all other forms of regular practice, Harish. I'm just going to confess that. I've seen people on there, they've done like these long, year-long retreats, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm like really bad at that stuff. But what I do love is just reading, and it doesn't take much. I don't have to read that much until I feel the stillness arising and the mind stops, and then I just hang out there, and then I read a bit more, then it stops, and we see how long we can, and just, so that's that understanding of the mind falling away into stillness as being the fundamental practice is something that has stayed with me. And I'm going to share a couple of clear things that where I got that. One, I remember reading in a very old Siddha Yoga publication about Guru Mai, and when Guru Mai, before she became the Guru, was with Muktananda, and he was just emphasizing to her again, are you practicing stopping the mind? Are you practicing stilling the mind? And he was asking her this while she's watching a baby calf suckle from the mother cow, and she's just contemplating devotion while he's wanting to know if she's practicing stopping the mind. And I thought, that's so interesting that he's so focused on making sure that she, his closest disciple, is doing this practice. And that struck me, and has always struck me, that he was so clear on that. And then I remember also, one of the main things we did in the ashram was seva, was service. The main practices are, meditation, chanting, and then service. And so while everyone else was attending a huge intensive, and she was there, and I was looking after the dish room, and I got nobody else in the dish room. So I got all the dishes from 1,600 people, and I'm washing them And I'm trying to get them all on the break to come in and watch them. But
that's happened to me, that exact thing, in the same ashram.
So it's like, and I was there doing and there was a pile of pots, and these are pots that they're nearly big enough you can get inside them. Pile of pots from the kitchen to scrub out. And I'm inside one of them there, and I'm so tired, and I'm just scrubbing away like this. And I'm thinking, why am I doing this? What the fuck? What's the point of this? I'm doing all this. Why? And at that point, suddenly my mind completely stopped. Absolutely deepest level of stillness. And I'm just in this empty space with a complete no thought whatsoever. It was a radical shift. And that hung around for like about 30 seconds, a minute. It didn't go on forever. I didn't dissolve into the universe, but it was just like, basically I was staring into the emptiness of the pot, which is a practice, as we know. And then I came out of that. It was so profound. And I turned around to somebody, and they said, there was one person there, and they said, you know, Gurumai was just standing right behind you and looking at you really intensely for about a minute. She's just walked off. So I was like, the guru, for me, that relationship is very, very intimate. And I've had many times where that has been verified in exactly that way. And secondly, stillness, stopping the mind. This is why we do practice, to take for the mind to stop, so we can be in that space, that non-conceptual experiencing space. So, these sort of experiences both verified my relationship with her, but also the importance of this practice and the practice of bringing the mind to concentration, and then to contemplation, then into stillness, and then staying in that space of stillness, non-conceptual experiencing. And so that architecture of understanding practice and also of experience itself has been fundamental, and that comes from the Kashmir Shaivism and then the interaction with the Siddha Yoga path.
Okay, so this is interesting because, in Kashmir Shaivism per se, the teaching is not stop the mind, still the mind. In fact, you can't force it to be still, right? The teaching is more about creating conditions in which the mind naturally subsides into this profound stillness. So I'm just wondering if you were sort of using shorthand, or do you think the mind can be stopped, or is it about creating those conditions in which it's likely to occur?
Well, the conditions in which it's likely to occur, particular keval, like spontaneous kumbhaka, how does that occur? Now, for me, that's a regular practice. I don't know how that occurs. That just seems to be a grace thing that happens. I read the scriptures, my breath stops, the mind stops. The conditions here are what? That's interesting to contemplate. But absolutely, the mind can be stopped. It's something you can do. This is something that I teach or in my course. And when I worked with clients, I don't so much now. I nearly taught all my clients how to stop the mind and rest in the center, even if it's just for a few seconds. But
so we'll come back to your story. We'll come back to your story, but let's just jump on this. Tell us how to stop the mind.
Well, there are several techniques given in Sutra 16, 17 in the Pratnabhinya Hridayam, and the methods there are given.
18, yeah. But
18, sorry.
For the listeners, right, how do you teach this stopping of the mind?
So when I teach, the simplest way, which is accessible to everyone, is simply relaxing the vocal muscles. So, this is the understanding that thought isn't this thing that's going on in this sort of Cartesian mind or consciousness thing that's different than the body. That thinking, there aren't such things as thoughts. Is thinking. It's like there's no such thing as memories. You're remembering and you're thinking. And thinking is something you're doing. It's an action. And basically, you're talking to yourself. So when you relax your vocal muscles, and one easy way to do that is just to open the mouth.
Relax the jaw.
Relax the jaw.
Yeah.
There's much less subvocalization, which is what thinking is. And in fact, there's research showing, I was just discussing this with the leading psychiatrist in America, there's research showing that people who have auditory hallucinations, schizophrenics with auditory hallucinations, if they do this, there's a massive reduction in their auditory hallucinations. So these are, these auditory hallucinations. It's self-talk, but they don't realize they're doing it. So when they do that and they just hold the mouth in an O, there will be much less self-talk. That's not necessarily that everybody stops, because some people can still sub-vocalize while they're doing that and not realize they're doing it. However, I would teach it particularly with fading the voice. So we would do the days of the week out loud, and with each day of the week, we relax the vocal muscles 50%. So I would model it for people and went to go like this. And it's like the Energizer Bunny running out of energy. So you're doing Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It's very simple. And when you do that, you can see what happens. You can see, I can watch somebody, and what happens as that happens, the vocal muscles relax, the eyes relax as well, because focusing and naming are the first part of experience. As that happens then, and you can see the person just drops off into silence. And then when I say open your eyes, if they open their eyes quickly, I know they're still talking, but generally they're coming up from the mind has completely switched off. So this method, just to give people the source for this method, particularly comes from Edmund Jacobson's work on progressive muscle relaxation. He was a brilliant professor, I can't remember, a physician professor at Cornell University, who did the fundamental work on muscle relaxation, defined the word relaxation, published it in 1929, his book Progressive Muscle Relaxation. So it was very clear from what Jacobson was showing that all thinking is covert muscular activity. So basically, relaxing the vocal muscles away into silence. And then how long can you stay there? Well, you can't stay there forever. We know that. Shakti moves.
But this is really interesting because it does correspond to teaching in the tradition, which is about taking mantra to ever subtler levels.
Yeah.
Loud, full out loud, then muttering under your breath, and then whispering, and then silent, but the mantra is still going. So that's a wonderful correspondence there.
Yes, and I remember noting that correspondence when I was did a workshop with Carlos, and he was doing teaching through the levels there. But here we would want to go straight into, well, it would be interesting because if you do that and you really drop all the subvocalization away. But I know, like Sally Kempton, my last conversation ever with her was asking her to give me sum up for me one teaching, Sally. I just dropped her off in London from having dinner with her and a few people. And she said, it's to follow the vibration of the mantra to its source. That was she said, that's it. And that was the last thing we ever discussed before. Very, very sadly, she passed away. So that idea of the vibration within, after all the subvocalization has stopped, and feeling the pulse there, I think you just have to be careful you're not still subvocalizing. What I watch is people are very good at doing, and if they're doing that, then what we call the mind is still operating, and we want to sink down into that deepest level of silence that I think for some people, and I know for some people, it's quite scary to let go of all mentation, to let go of all, because it's the way they control, it's the way they hold control. So it feels like there's a massive amount of trust for some people in doing that and just going into this empty space, what feels like an empty space.
Yeah.
So that's one method. I can give you more, but that's one. The other is just to say stop. So if you just say the word stop, the mind stops for an instant.
Yeah.
That's an old behavior therapy technique. And so we, have thought they were just going stop. And as soon as that happens, there's a gap. And mind the gap, right? That's our practice. Use the gap, mind the gap. From that gap, now we can turn off into something new. The point here is to stop the mind, not forever, but so that then something new and aligned and inspired can come forth.
Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. So we can jump into some of the fascinating subjects you teach, and I especially love the counterintuitive things you have to say that are initially counterintuitive, but actually revelatory. Perhaps before that, you could fill in a little bit of how you came to the disciplines of hypnotherapy and cognitive behavioral therapy and the different modalities that you work with now, and what you discovered about those.
Sure. No, I think that's an interesting journey. I was 5 years in India in Gurudev Siddhapeeth, and then 10 years in upstate New York in Sri Muktananda Ashram. And there, I'd met my wife, and we had a 6-year-old daughter. And so after 15 years of ashram life, we left, and I arrived in London, and I had a job doing some marketing for Try Yoga with Jonathan. That's, if you remember, we met then, and I introduced you to doing the teacher training program in the United Kingdom.
We had met before at the ashram, but you don't remember that.
No, I do. Okay. And of course, I know your mum very well, Surabhi. Yeah. So, but then, and so anyway, I was doing some marketing for Jonathan there, and then that job fell away. And what was I going to do next? I had a family to look after. I've done all this experience and knowledge. I've got a background degree in psychology and philosophy from Sheffield Hallam University. But I got, people kept saying, you're a teacher, you're a healer, that's what you need to be doing, not marketing. And I was like, yeah, but how do I do it? Counseling, clinical psychology which I wanted to do, was just not possible for me because of the degree I'd ended up with. And it was a huge, at any point in time, it's a very difficult area to get into. Counseling psychology didn't interest me. Becoming a psychotherapist was a 4-year training to learn to talk to people about their childhood, and that didn't interest me. And counseling, just pure counseling, non-directive counseling, again, I was like, well, how do I use this? So somebody said, why don't you study hypnotherapy? You can train really quickly, and then you'll be working with people, helping change, their habits, and everything will start from there. And I was like, well, that sounds really cool, but I'll be honest, Harish, hypnosis had not been on my radar. I associated with stage hypnosis. I associated with sort of lots of sloppy sort of thinking about the subconscious mind or the unconscious mind or trance or past lives. And to me, that was like really, I'm a pretty rigorous, skeptical thinker for all of my involvement in deep spirituality in India. I strip away all the superfluous culture stuff and want to get to the core principles. So I thought it was a pretty flimsy thing, and really on the fringe of psychology. And that's simply because also the psychology degree I'd studied had not covered hypnosis at all. And yet it is and now it's an even more of a main topic in psychology. So I looked around at different training schools, and you could train pretty quickly, but they're all into like inducing trance and putting suggestions into the unconscious mind. And I was like, I can't relate to any of this. And then I found this place called the UK College of Hypnosis and Hypnotherapy. It was run by somebody called Donald Robertson. And they said evidence-based, science-aligned approach, also based on Greek philosophy. And I was like, okay, that's quite different. So I called him up. I can't do his Scottish accent. He's a heavy Scottish accent. But he said, yeah, come along. He said, if you don't like it after the first day, I'll give you your money back. So I went along, and I absolutely loved it. This blend of what he put together, which was all the research into hypnosis, which is extensive, pulling it together and say, what story does that say? All the research into what makes therapy generally effective. What does that say? What do you use to treat particular conditions in terms of behavior therapy and cognitive therapy particularly? How does that integrate with hypnosis? And then also underscoring this with an existentialist. He had 2 master's degrees, one in psychoanalysis, the other in philosophy. And but he'd done his paper, I think, on Sartre. So a big focus on existentialism and also Stoicism and Greek philosophy. Now, Donald's gone on to become one of the leaders in modern Stoicism. Some people might have heard of him. You can look him up. He's done lots of books on that area. But at this point, he was running the training college, and I found it an absolute feast. It was brilliant. He particularly trained me in a very strong skeptical, evidence-based approach. Hypnosis is founded on skepticism, true hypnosis. Doesn't believe in energies or anything like that. It believes everything is down to imagination and belief and the placebo effect. So this constant questioning of where's the evidence for that? Where's the evidence for that? Where's the evidence for that? And so looking at every claim and going, well, what would constitute evidence to support that claim? And where is that evidence? Do we have it? So I was trained very strongly in that. That provided a sort of clash for me between also how did I integrate all my spiritual experience here with this very kind of hard-nosed, sort of skeptical, scientific approach to therapy. That was a challenge, and I resolved that. We can talk about how I resolved that later if you want, but that training was phenomenal. And I set myself up as a cognitive, and we can talk about some of the key elements in there, because I think, well, the muscle relaxation is one. I set myself up as a cognitive behavioral hypnotherapist. That's what the training was about, hypnosis and cognitive behavioral therapy. And began to practice using this method, reading more and more of all the material in the course, which was just so extensive, and then all the books that were pointed to, which was one of the great things that is recommended texts on any course. What to read and what not to read is perhaps one of the most important things in life. And I treated thousands. I had a very successful practice in North and Central London. My wife joined me as co-director of the practice, doing the finance and the admin, supported my family, living a nice part of North London, entirely as a cognitive behavioral hypnotherapist, and only using this method. I did go off and study a little bit of acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which is really interesting. We can talk about that in a moment. Then integrated that into the approach. And so that's how I got into it. And I loved the whole understanding of hypnosis, meditation, how these two are related, similarities and differences, but also the way in which cognitive behavioral therapy and its approach is both highly empirical in terms of the way it's based on, experimental psychology, things like looking at problem solving or attentional biases that we can see, and then developing treatment programs based off of the science, and then testing them pretty rigorously, in terms of, the randomized control trials. And I just love all of that. I just find it absolutely fascinating. Their commitment to the science in that community is strong. And the model of the scientist clinician is a really interesting one. There are a number of people that are kind of heroes, I think, for us in sort of the cognitive behavioral therapy area. And now I've taken over the college. Donald emigrated in 2013 and said, would you like to take over? And I said, absolutely. So my wife and I took over the college, and we've since built it out in lots of interesting ways. But one of the main things is how to integrate Eastern philosophy, the Kashmir Shaivism, or what I'm going to call certainly non-conceptual self, into that. And I think that's we can talk about that point a little bit more if you want, because I think that's a really interesting juncture. Notions of self. CBT doesn't have much, cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't have much to say about the notion of self, you see. ACT does address that issue. CBT just kind of bypasses it. Of course, psychodynamic, other approaches like the wounded self, and but CBT doesn't, cognitive behavioral therapy doesn't. So the notion of self in these different therapies is I'm going to write a piece on this because it's really interesting to be able to see that. And it was that doorway, particularly through acceptance and commitment therapy's concept of self, that allowed me to then bring in the entire approach of Eastern sort of philosophical practice, if we want to talk it, or applied psychology into the model that we were teaching, as well as retaining sort of the existentialism and Greek philosophy as well.
So let's cut to the chase of the really helpful practical stuff a bit, just because I know people are going to be fascinated with that. So let's just take a example, right? What do you say to someone, or how do you start with someone who comes to you and says, I'm just plagued by my thoughts. I can't stop thinking and ruminating all the time. And my emotions are all over the place. And I just don't, I'm not convinced that any real change is possible. I might get a little bit better, but it seems like we're just stuck with the minds that we have in this life. And, I seem to be trapped within my mind. What do you say to the person?
Well, the first thing we're going to note here is our client is talking a bunch of sweeping generalities about themselves and their life, right?
Yeah.
And that's not what life is. This is a trick of language. Yeah, to talk in generalities. Life is about concrete specifics, like this moment that's happening right now. So the first thing I would say, okay, well, can you give me an example? I'm sure this isn't a 10 all the time, is it? You know, I mean, is it happening when you're sleeping? What about when you're on the loo, brushing your teeth? You know, I'll draw some things. So, okay, no. So give me an example of where this showed up for you strongly recently. Okay, boom. So we're into what triggered that. So it will be a specific, I was watching TV and seeing this happy couple and suddenly my thoughts were, well, whatever it is, or I got a name wrong in a meeting, or I was in a meditation retreat with Harish and he was talking about this and I couldn't relate to it. And then I thought I'm useless at this. And then I just had to leave the retreat. And then I got myself so worked up. Whatever it is, you know, there's a triggering situation and this triggers off all this stuff that goes on. What we're going to do is we're going to map out and notice what we could map out what was going on beforehand. You know, were there some things that were we know whether there were going to be predisposing factors in terms of personality factors. Well, some the person's, well, they were drunk the night before and they and they smoked a bunch of dope and they woke up in the morning and they felt really weird and they began to have a panic. You know, I mean, who knows? So we want to have some sense of what might have led up to that, what triggers it. But this is an ongoing pattern. So it's not so much substance that it triggered. We can see the pattern. We're going to map out the pattern very specifically for that situation. And also what's going on, you know, thoughts. So what thoughts do you have? What feelings going on here? And I do use some very simple emotional categories, which are not, their emotions are not essences. I completely agree with Lisa Feldman Barrett on this, but they're very useful to be able to notice what type of thing, fear, anger, sadness, how strong was that? From 0 to 100, where 100 is the strongest ever been in your life. Okay, so we're getting them out of black and white thinking, simply into like looking at what was the thought, what were the feelings, and then what were some other thoughts, and then what did you do? So we want to notice thoughts, feelings, behavior in that situation. Now, typically the person would say, well, then I lie in my bed for like 2 hours and thought, what's the fucking point? This is interesting. This is all interesting stuff. We can see the pattern here. What's going on? So then we're going to start to work out, okay, well, how would you like, I might ask the person, how would you like to handle that situation? Well, I'd like to be thinking this. I'd like to be, okay, well, that's good. So we can start to see how they'd like to be thinking, or they might have some, well, I mustn't ever think negative thoughts. And we're going to go, well, that's going to be a bit of a problem if that's your rule. So let's discuss that. Do you think that's true? So, you know, it's just about taking what are very often generalities and coming down and zooming right in on exactly what's going on. Now, certain of those thoughts will be very painful. Yeah, particularly, perhaps we might notice that they think, oh, I'm not good enough. And they start to have a lot of strong negative emotion going on. We want them to notice that. We want to map it out. Now, part of this, we might write the thoughts out even on a flip chart. Donald Robertson used to use a flip chart because when you write your chronic thoughts out on the other side of the room on a big flip chart and the two of you sit there and look at them like this, it's quite interesting because you realize they're complete rubbish. You know, it's like, what am I saying to myself? But there's still, you know, they trigger a lot of emotion. Okay, so let's talk about a painful thought that triggers a lot of emotion, for example, as being one of the core issues here. How do we work with that? Well, there's a number of different ways. I mean, we could, again, let's take the concept of generalities that are going on here. The person is doing what we call a global rating of themselves. They're globally rating themselves. I'm not good enough is the classically really not defined at all global rating. You know, so you say, well, in what ways don't you think you're good enough? Well, I'm just incompetent. I'm stupid. I'm incompetent is a classic global rating that many professionals have, perfectionists, etc. And so what we notice is they're globally rating themselves rather than specific behavior. So when does that show up? What did you do? I want to show them that they're rating. They move from rating the behavior into rating themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And global rating is the problem. And then they're going to get into it. And it's something they're doing. So Albert Ellis, the great father of sort of rational cognitive therapy, called this self-downing. So now it's very interesting because he's putting a verb on this. It's something you're doing. You're self-downing. So then we'll list out all the self-downing stuff. Sometimes I'll give a whole list. I'll go, which of these self-downing thoughts are you engaging in? And By doing that, I'm normalizing it, so they see that everybody else has this stuff. And then what emotions go along with that? So we can start to approach it, if you will, intellectually, and that's fine to do as long as you allow the emotions to be there. So I'll talk about, let's rate the intellectual belief and the emotional belief. How strong is the intellectual belief now? How strong is the emotional belief? As you pay attention and use percentage ratings, for example. And as you do that, that allows people to not get in black and white, and the emotional belief starts to shift as you do that. That will be one way of tackling that. But there are other ways. I developed a particular method of working with painful thoughts using what I call exposure on overhead transparencies. But better think of it as if I wrote that thought on a window. So if I wrote on the window, if you suffer from depression, like one of the thoughts you might have is, I'm a failure, right? That's a classic depression thought. I failed, I'm a failure. So if you write that on a window and the depressed client can't look out through the window, they just see they get stuck on the thought. Does that make sense? Now, metaphor of thoughts as writing on a window, or I do overhead transparencies, is really interesting, because what I will do then is I'll have them hold both hands, and then I do exposure on the thought. So exposure, for everybody, exposure therapy means staying with something and not leaving until the emotions subside. So, if you're phobic of cats, the classic experiment by Professor Isaac Marks is you stay in the room with the cats, the heart rate goes up, 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 and then eventually, after about 20 minutes, it starts to come down, and then the cats come closer, it goes up a bit, and it goes down, and then eventually, this is called habituation. So you stay with the thing you fear, the emotions go up, and they come down. We call this going through the anxiety hump. The emotions go up and they come down. It's processing. It's just the keys in the word, Harish, emotion. They change. But the reason why they don't change is people don't allow themselves to feel them and stay with them. Not try and digest them, just stay with them and watch them. So I would take that thought, I'm a failure, write it out here. I've got a great video demo of this, and with somebody who has depression, and they hold it like that. And the feeling, they're scared, first of all, to hold it. Just to look at the thought, they're scared, which is really interesting. And then they stay with that. And I don't let them move their eyes from it. And they look at the thought and they tell me what sensation is in the body. Now, typically a thought like that will create some disturbance in the body and a tension, maybe in the legs, in the chest. I'll say, where's that? What's the sensation in the body? So they'll be looking and seeing what's happening in the body. And then I'll say, what emotion are you feeling here? Or what emotions, and I'll keep it to fear, anger, sadness. We'll label them, we'll rate them. Then we'll come back to look at the thought. We'll notice sensation in the body. We'll become aware of the emotion, accept it, label it. Labeling emotions always downregulates them. Rating them helps downregulate and watch them change. Within 2 minutes, the emotions have come right up and they've come down. Then we'll do some other things. Might have them a classic one is bring the thought closer like this. This guy gets nervous to bring the transparency closer with the thought on it, because of course he's scared of the feelings. I want them to not be scared of the feelings. Feeling sadness is okay. It's just a temporary thing that's coming up with this thought, and then move it away again. And that as he moves it away, that will change the relationship with the thought completely. What happens is within 2 minutes, maybe 4 or 5 minutes, the emotions have gone completely, or down to like 5%, fear or anger or sadness or combinations. And the meaning has come out of it doesn't mean anything. This writing that meant so much before, this is emotional processing. It's cognitive exposure with emotional processing. There are many other things. Sometimes I can have them pay attention to the style of the writing that it's written on. How's the ink flow on that? And they look at it. And suddenly it turns into hieroglyphics as they focus on the process instead of the content. Really interesting content. The meaning falls out of it, and suddenly they'll go, that doesn't mean anything. Because I'll turn the plastic around the other way. Does that? No, turn it around that way. They get disturbed. Turn it around that way. It doesn't mean anything. So and the thing is what happens is they want to look at me, or they want to go on to another thought. And I don't allow that. I say, no, stay with that thought.
Yeah.
Just stay with the thought. What happens is, within 5 minutes, the emotions have dropped out and the meaning has changed. This is a thought that's disturbed them for so long, which they keep. As soon as they touch on it, boom, they want to go on to, you see, so they go from thought to thought to thought to avoid the emotions. Thought
Exactly.
is an avoidance of emotions. As Salter, my beloved Salter, says, thought is a smokescreen on the emotions.
Yeah. So this is fascinating. I love it because, like you said, someone can be plagued by a thought or belief and the associated feelings for so many years, and here in 5 minutes, it's been massively mitigated. They just never did this before, right? To just stay with it until it's not such a big deal anymore. And then until they see through the thought, they see that it is just a thought. It's brilliant to write it on transparency. A thought is something you can see through. And there's one more element here that you're not naming, but it's easier for me to see because I know you, which is the impact of the dynamic between the therapist and the client. And for example, you're someone who has this enormous confidence, like quiet confidence and presence. And here you are saying with total confidence, it's absolutely okay. It's okay to be feeling this. And even though you don't name it, I would say that is a very important factor in the process. It's not just the technique, going through the technique, right? But the presence that you're bringing of this like reorientation to, oh, this feeling that I thought was so horrible. He's saying it's not so horrible. It's okay. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot to say there in terms of, who and how the therapist is in themselves. So I spend a lot of time with the therapists we train on them learning to do mindfulness, leaves on the stream, watch their thoughts, but also do a lot of muscle relaxation work so they're not an agitated, restless beast in the room. There's a deep calmness in their body, which is communicated. And this openness and authenticity, of course, that comes from the Salter as well. So we can talk about that in a moment. However, let's talk about this particular. I'm also passionate that they understand the method, how it works, and that they do not buy into the story of the client that they're this thing. So I've got a client there that's absolutely crying. I mean, the emotions will be really strong when we do this. Let's be clear. I mean, I brought people out. I do live demos of this in class. I brought people out that look super competent, bring them out, and they are like, they've suddenly been exposed to these thoughts and they're crying in front of the class. It's really intense. But I'm confident, A, the emotion will pass if they don't jump onto another thought, and B, that they are not that thought. And I know you're convinced. That is the fundamental thing. You must know that they are not that. Do not be hypnotized by their limiting belief. You know they are not that. You know that, for me, of course, they're Shiva, So I'm watching Shiva here having this contracted experience, getting all upset. And that's like, I know it's going to be fine. And I know how the process works. And I know how it doesn't work. And also, I train all my therapists, when a method doesn't work, they should get twice as interested, because that's the client is doing something that's maintaining the problem. And that is probably therapeutic gold dust is there when they're doing it. So when something that works doesn't work, something's going on there. You want to find out. And we're not going to dredge into the past. I'm just very present moment, phenomenologically oriented. Exactly what is going on. What were you thinking? What were you saying? What were you looking at? Where was the attention? What did that mean for you? What came up then? So when I'm working with clients like that, I'm confident that it's going to, but it is that's an intense exercise. And then the therapists are trained being able to be with a client when they're in a moment of intense distress and hold space for that with the confidence that this is going to, it's going to work, it takes some time and experience. But cognitive behavioral therapists particularly are good at that. They have to get good at it, so taking people through panic disorder, so, essentially that involves having them self-induce a panic attack, so that they can learn that actually it's not dangerous. It's just their system. But when you do that for the first time as a therapist and your client has a panic attack in the session, and in a controlled way, but in the session, it's a bit freaky, for you so therapists need to build their robustness, and confidence in method and themselves, and also know what to do if things do start to if the client starts to just, okay, how to ground in the present moment, bring them out of it, etc. So, yeah, you need to be confident about assisting clients in states of extreme emotion. You need to know how emotion works and to be able to take them through this stuff. But then you can take them through some stuff quite quickly, actually. Now, I would say as well, Harish, I don't want to give that as a method that I would... Oh, I have done that in the first session sometimes, because I think it's a good way to learn about thought. It's a good metaphor for thought. However, generally, working on some of those more deeper sort of core low self-esteem, fixed low self-esteem stuff, you're going to do that a little bit later when we built more of a therapeutic relationship. And the therapeutic relationship, let's be clear, I would prefer the term working alliance, perhaps, because I can define that a little bit more. Relationships a bit, but is the glue by which we can do the stuff in therapy because of the glue of the relationship. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's the same in your work in as well. Because of the strength of the relationship, the person then has that creates the container within which they can have these varied experiences. And the gold is always over the uncomfortable stuff. Holding them over the uncomfortable stuff is where change is going to happen, not in the comfort zone. Hey, well, generally, I could give another answer to all of that as well, but that's it. We could take a strengths-based approach and just build. I mean, I've got a very, very experienced senior clinical psychologist who's trained with us. She's now on our advisory board, and she's like, she works with OCD, and she ended up doing just a single session on OCD using a strengths-based hypnosis approach and psychoeducation, and it worked. And she goes, "That's crazy. That shouldn't work, but it did." Because usually with OCD, it's like a whole thing, you've got to do. But just building up the person's resources, insights, so they can cope. People feel they can't cope. That's why people come to therapy. They come to therapy because they become demoralized. They feel they can't cope anymore. So fundamentally, all therapy is about building up that sense of I can cope. We could talk about therapy as rhetoric if you want, by the way. That's a whole interesting theme in its own right.
But there are many interesting themes. So we have certain topics to get to here now. But before we go there, I'm just interested, are there any of the spiritual teachings of Shaivism that you have in your work under some different name with different language, without any of the Sanskrit, of course? Are there any teachers or practices from the spiritual tradition that you studied deeply that you incorporate, or do you feel like it's more of like a background for you that gave you this confidence in human transformation and the divinity of the self and so on?
No, absolutely. And let's go through a few of these. Stillness practice. So we teach this on the course, and I've even incorporated it also into some of the standard hypnosis scripts and protocols. There's in the end, we could do less, do nothing, rest in stillness, relax into yourself completely, do nothing. The feeling of being you when you're not doing anything. So this is something that's introduced early on, both stillness and resting in being, ceasing doing, being mode, not doing mode, and relaxing into yourself and noticing the full completeness of that. So, and then expanding that. So the more the individual spends time in their own center, madhya, where there's just stillness, resting in the Sushumna if you want, the more that expands, the more they have recourse to that, and they can take refuge, come back to that center again and again. So the expansion of the center is not just a one-time thing. It becomes, the more you practice, as you know, the more it expands, the more you can access it. So that's something we're teaching as, and also that's how creativity springs, from that point at which all the habitual thoughts stop and you rest in stillness. So that will be one. Another is more of a background thing for me, but is belief in my client. Belief in my client, and it's interesting to look. There's not so many therapists. Carl Rogers writes about the core conditions, but he didn't really talk also about the belief in your client, that you see the potential in them. You don't buy their story. You see the greatness, And so for me, my client is Shiva in front of me, heavily contracted very often, but still is Shiva in front of me. And I do have a belief in the power of perception as well. I felt that very much in the presence of Guru Mai, that her perception elevated me. Does that make sense? So we have a power. So I'm holding that space and seeing that and trying to draw that forth in everything I do in some ways. Yeah, that's that. So that informs. Do I teach that so explicitly? Obviously, I don't teach Shaivism in the course. But I would also teach very much first-person experiencing. So I would summarize that as be the seer, never the seen. Be the seer, never the seen. I'm not sure where that comes, but I mean, it's in the literature somewhere, isn't it? So be so busy seeing that you are never seen. Now, if you think, Sartre talks about the sense of, he gives an example of looking through a keyhole and watching, say, a couple making love, and you get totally involved in this you're watching through the keyhole. Then you hear some steps behind you, and suddenly your awareness shifts and you become aware that you're an object, you're othered by somebody else. Does that make sense?
Of course, yeah.
So this sense of being an object for other people, this is very interesting. And I aimed, and I developed some methods for fundamentally undermining that. And so that I call it the movie camera of awareness. So, and we just going, what are you doing in my movie? What are you doing in my movie? So because self-consciousness, you see, is going around feeling like I'm appearing in everyone else's movie and I'm trying to work out how I'm doing in their movie. How do I look in your movie? Which, when you think about it, let's just take this apart, is completely bonkers, because I do not know how I look in your movie through your eyes. All I'm doing is I'm imagining how I look. Then I try to manage my behavior to how I imagine I look through which is why self-consciousness is the biggest, just irrational waste of conscious energy on this earth.
And source of suffering.
So I developed a very rapid way of taking people out of that, so they never have to experience themselves as an object for others again. And we can this comes back to some Salter ideas as well. The root of this is inhibition of the orienting reflex. So that orienting reflex is that reflex the animal has, that what's that? What's that? What's that? If you watch a dog sitting in a garden, it's not sitting still. Its nose, its ears, its whiskers, it's going, what's that? Every little noise, the attention orients. Icha Shakti. It's going, what's this? What's this? So if that becomes inhibited, it's a real problem. And Salter gives the example here and says, it will be a sad dog that came into a room and did not explore the room.
Yeah.
But this is self-consciousness. Can you see that? We're sad dogs that come into rooms and we avoid eye contact, we shuffle out. We don't come in with our chest open, our ears up, smelling the air, going, hey, what's here for me? Dogs are not self-conscious. They don't have that. Yeah. If you look at them in the eyes, they retreat because that's just intense. But that actual initial retreat of the eyes is the problem. And so I developed a way of training people out of that retreat of the eyes very rapidly, so that they can just have this, they don't know, their eyes no longer retreat from the world. And they, instead of reverting inside how they feel and how they think they look to others, they're just going, what are you doing in my movie? And what are you doing in that wonderful question, and I'm sure you've asked it. I think maybe Swami Shantahananda has it in his book on Prajnabinya, which is, are you in the room, or is the room in your awareness? I'm sure you've done that one. Yeah. We all use that one a lot. It's so empowering but it's so interesting that we all go, oh, I'm in the room. And that immediately tells you that we're all relating ourselves as objects. We've so learned to relate to ourselves as objects in the room, objects in the economy, objects in the family, instead of being the power of being the experiencing subject. And that when people settle into that experience of being the experiencing subject, there is an empowerment that comes in and a profound settlement in their being.
Yeah, that's hugely important, because the fact that people say, well, I'm in the room, shows that they're regarding themselves from the third person point of view, which is bizarre because they only ever have first person experience.
Yeah.
And from the first person perspective, it's just obvious, oh, the room is in my awareness. Well, there's nowhere else for it to be. But that shift can be utterly amazing, profound for people, because they just never even realized I'm constantly monitoring myself from a third person point of view. I have a body image and a self image that is determined by the third person perspective, not the first person perspective, which is the only one that's real.
Exactly. So, the book, the Zen book on having no head. I don't know if you must know that one.
Yeah.
So we teach, so we want people in this first person experiencing, and you're absolutely right. So that sense of being, of course. So I'll give you one of the things we do. Instead of we have people imagine coming into an empty room and exploring it. Okay. And there's no other, nobody else there. So there's no self-consciousness and just exploring the room. Then they come in, imagine coming in, the room's got a bunch of people in it, but they're all watching something. So they just see the backs of people's heads. And some people have a bit of tension. And the first moment of self-consciousness, by the way, I'm really into momentariness, breaking experience down moment by moment. So the first element of self-consciousness is a slight freeze and tensing in the body. Always begins with the muscles. Then the attention reverts inside. Then the person notices the feelings inside. So generally, as they're coming into a first empty room, no self-consciousness, room with like 40 people, but looking at the backs of their heads. Most people don't. A few people have a little, but most people don't. Then they have them imagine one person turns around and looks at them, and they become an object, and then they feel it. This tension, the eyes retreat, they go inside, and then we have them notice, accept, relax the muscles, because we train them in muscle relaxation, and then how to shift the attention back out. Let's say notice Harish's beard. How many gray hairs he got in his mustache, and which side is evenly, and make them really inspect and use their self-talk. And this is a key, by the way. Use their self-talk to regulate their attention. The function of language fundamentally is to regulate attention. So using language to point your movie camera here, here, here. Notice this, notice this, notice this. Until they achieve 100% external attention, 0% internal attention. And then we have another person turn around, and then they contract again, go inside, and they relax and move their attention back out until they can keep their attention 100% external. The whole room is looking at them in their imagination, this is. And then we have maybe the cameras come in, then people sing happy birthday, and they're all just going, what are you doing in my movie? Does that make, yeah? So we're doing graded exposure here. It's a fundamental principle of starting with a little bit and then building the skills of coping and mastery up through starting with a tiny dose in a controlled way in their imagination. I mean, I could try and set that up in a real life situation, but it'd be hard work. This is what I use hypnosis for. Hypnosis is just a way of running intense imagining experiences, which are just running simulations that allow us to update the way. Well, everything is imagination anyway, but let's talk about that in a minute. But so
yeah, okay. So,
there are other teachings as well, but that gives you a sense of some of the incorporation.
Yeah. And just one thing I wanted to mention, which is, people are used to language in personal development work of like, oh, it's not that, it's this. And it's quite binary. And in Shaivism, we see instead three, like that, then this, and then this, right? And just to give the example, so you're all confused by these emotions, right? And then you learn to label them, and you learn they're normal, right? They're normalized even in the naming of them, right?
Yeah.
And then if you're following the Shaivism way anyway, you go beyond the need to label them, and you get curious about what we're calling emotion as just energy. It's somatic energy. It's sensation. It's the breath changing. It's, oh, isn't this interesting? And I don't need to label it because I'm not afraid of it anymore. I don't think something's wrong, but I had to have that interim step of labeling it, right? So this is like going from normal vikalpas to shuddha vikalpas to nirvikalpa, right? And similarly, there's a similar pattern with the thing you mentioned. Uh, I, I'm the seen. Oh my God, I'm seen. What do people think of me? 2, no, I'm the seer. Much more empowering, much better situation, right? But then in Shaivism and in Dzogchen, some other non-dual traditions, you go beyond that to a collapse of dichotomy. So seer and seen have collapsed into pure seeing. There's no doer and there's no done. There's no, instead of seer and versus seen, it's just pure seeing. And that of course, that's the spiritual step, right? That's a more advanced step. But I just find it interesting that in Shaivism we have this, 1, 2, 3, as opposed to just 1, 2. It's not that, it's this. And does that play into your work at all, or what do you think of that principle?
Well, whatever's useful for people at a given point in time. Okay, I'm fundamentally a very strong pragmatist, and I'm very into the upayas. Levels of practice. You need to, what's useful for you right now. At some point, having that experience of like, it's all kind of, there's no one doing it. It's just all being done. It's all complete non-dualism, wonderful. But hanging out in that forever is just, I think, A, it's not likely to happen. And B, so experience oscillates, and we oscillate through different levels of experience, of experiencer, through different levels of I-ness, and agency. And we could talk a lot about that, because I think the ripping out of agency from Shaivism is a deep problem. I think the fundamentally agency is what makes it what it is. So I'm interested in helping people live their lives more fully. If they want to kind of go into this, into the non-dual spiritual and live from that place all the time, I think that's generally quite unrealistic, and B, is often an avoidance. But C, if they want to go there, fine, but people also need to pay their bills. They need to get things done. They want to resolve their relationships. So I'm into how do people cope with the challenges they face in their lives and the goals they want to do. For yourself, you have that experience, yes, and also you want to write books and you want to do this, and these are things you want to be able to accomplish and do. And those, you could say, well, going into that non-dual state allows me, but generally you're going to have to come down and you're going to be oscillating through different layers and trying to figure out how to resolve this issue. I've got to pay the bills this month. How am I going to do that? Well, I'll just go into non-dual state. Well, maybe, but maybe the emotions are there for purpose. You see, they have information. So emotions have information. So naming the emotion is one thing, but noticing, what's going on here? So I'm experiencing fear. Okay, how much fear? This much fear. Okay, so what's going on here? So I'm sensing I'm under threat here. How am I under threat? That I'm going to lose my job? Okay, am I really going to lose my job? Is that a problem if I lose my job? Not really. I could get another job. So you see, the person could go through. So there's a story going, you would call it a story, a series of appraisals and thoughts going on here behind the emotion, and those are worthy of attention in terms of problem solving. Does that make sense? So there's probably the most underrated psychotherapy is called problem solving therapy. It's based off problem solving research in psychology, which is extensive. It's extremely effective, and it's been relabeled now emotion-centered problem solving therapy because people think it's all too intellectual. You use your emotions as cues. Hey, there's a problem. So for me, I would look at, I'm sad. I'm suddenly, what am I feeling? Sad. Well, that's interesting. So a sense of loss. Sadness is about loss. What do I feel? I feel I've lost the potential of all that friendship with that person from that little interaction now. Wow, is that really true? You see, so you can track on this stuff, and the emotions are there to help us. So because I look at emotions as being related then into behavior, and the emotions they're the keys in the word emote. They move out. So emotions are ways in which the organism moves out into behavior. You see, and so I'm very much more focused on behavior and activity. I just want to talk about practicality.
Sure.
of how to help people have more agency in their lives, and not feel they are a puppet, and then feel like the only way to do is to surrender all to, well, everything just happens spontaneously, so agency. Yeah.
So I won't debate that with you because, I mean, we will get to agency. I won't debate this characterization of the non-dual state that you gave, because I think it's a misunderstanding in certain subtle ways. As a kind of spiritual experience, you can't be in spiritual experience all the time, of course, but there's a non-dual mode which is compatible with any activity, I would argue. But we're going to have to discuss that another time, because we have two really important topics to hit, and that's Salter and agency. And so just more briefly with the first one, because I think you and I agree on this, right? So this fellow Andrew Salter, who wrote 75 years ago or whatever, maybe is out of fashion now, but you think should come back in fashion. And at least we agree, you and I, on his teaching on disinhibition, his teaching on becoming natural, not constantly inhibiting yourself. As I've mentioned to you, that teaching is in Shaivism as well. Kshemarajya gives exactly that teaching, that doubt, hesitation, and inhibition are the nails which paralyze you, which stake you to the earth and make you fearful and paralyzed, right? But just briefly for people, could you summarize this teaching of the value of disinhibition and how it's not as crazy as it sounds? And everyone remember, this is an Englishman talking, right? The most inhibited culture on earth.
and Harish, just as a sidebar, we should talk about hypnosis and explain that a little bit, because people are going to be, that term is heavily confused. So let's come back to that as another thing. We're just going to expand quite quickly. Andrew Salter, I came across his work when I first took this course with Donald Robertson, and it blew me away. One, the strength of his writing, which was like, I was like, holy, who writes like that? Made Hemingway seem weak to me. I mean, it was just like so forceful, his style. But then what he was teaching was so radical, which was a return to spontaneity, to authenticity, to naturalness, to get back to this childlike nature of spontaneous response to things around us. Oh, look at that. Wow, look at that red ball. God, that looks a bit messy on you. Just this honesty in our response, whereby emotions are directly and immediately expressed into behavior, generally through language. And it was just so radical and so exciting, because it seemed in contradiction to the whole, like, contra natura, go against your nature spiritual discipline of the East. And yet it was very obvious that this was, and everybody then saying, you've got to wait till you're liberated before you can do all that free stuff. And it was like, no. It was really clear that this was the only way to actually be in contact with people, was to actually express how you feel. Otherwise, what's going on? So this inhibition is basically where your spontaneous responses to things have been conditioned away. Don't speak so loud. Don't do that. Sit upright. So the child begins to retreat into his or herself, and not express spontaneously what they're feeling. And we love children because of that spontaneous expression. When they start to retreat into themselves, things start to get very complicated and very confusing for everybody. And so and now that has to happen. We can't just be going around going, wow, you love, there needs to be some inhibition, some control of that spontaneous response. But where that has become dysfunctional and it is automatic and uncontrolled inhibition, this is the problem. Then people cannot dance with life. They can't respond to stimuli immediately. They can't actually taste things, because the taste of life requires this immediate response. It's become squelched out of them. So, and also nobody can know them. And they don't know other people either, because they're living inside this whole, So, for example, giving compliments. One of the practices here that Salter has is to accept compliments and to give compliments. Say, somebody says, "Well, that was a really clever thing." You go, "Well, thank you very much," and I think you're very clever for noticing that as well. So, but when you work with somebody who's inhibited, and most of my clients are, we find out, they'll go, oh, I can, when people say that stuff, I don't think they're being honest. I think they're just trying to please me. And I say, well, that's a very interesting theory. Is that what you do? And they'll go, yes. So because they are liars, they think everyone else is liars, you see? So they're not honest, and so they think everyone else is dishonest. And so once you begin to practice this direct, open, straightforward honesty, and of course it can get you into trouble, and you need to be careful. If you're in a marriage that's got potential of violent partner, this is not something you practice in that. As a therapist, first we're going to assess how safe is this situation. We don't want people suddenly losing their jobs because they start to speak up in the meeting. But we want them to begin to speak up. We want them to begin to express themselves. And Salter's work on disinhibition, and that comes from Pavlov's word for that was unbreaking the nervous system. So the nervous system is too braked. It's like because as Salter says, it's like you've driven around and hit so many cars that you drive around with the brakes on all the time now. And the cars you've hit, of course, have been mum and dad and older brothers and these different figures who have caused you then to retreat into yourself. So you drive around with the brakes on all the time. Or I would add another thing, you're riding the clutch as well. You never let the power, you never take the brakes off. You never let the full power go down onto the road. When it does for the first time, sure, it's like, whoa, yeah, you express your feelings. It felt a bit shaky because you're not used to doing it. Once you get used to doing it, you can do that with more and more skill, and you're now working in harmony with you're not camped out against your emotions. You're using your emotions to guide your behavior. That's what they're there for. That's what they evolved for. That's what they evolved for. Is that?
Yes, but what about the emotions that are not appropriate or tuned to the reality of the situation, but are rather attuned to the unresolved impressions of your past, or attuned to your irrational fears? Like those emotions, how are they guides to behavior when they're not tuned to the reality of the present?
Well, that's true. But the only way you're going to get that updating happening is when you start to be honest and straightforward and actually start to apply them. There's no other way around that. So unless you start to work with how your system actually works, and this is the way it works, if you want to complicate it again, it's just going to get more complicated. Does that make sense? So You've got to begin there. Now, obviously, the safety of the therapy session becomes somewhere where this can start. But we want the client to explore it in different places, not the places that trigger them intensely. Learn to open up with everybody you meet. When you get to the bus stop, have a chat with them. I give an example of a young lady I work with, and she didn't feel comfortable at work. She didn't feel she was properly professional, and we were working on the Salter stuff. She wanted to go off and become a yoga teacher. Well, maybe. So eventually she comes in, and we're talking one session. Go, you've got to put this into practice. She leaves. This was in Primrose Hill when we were in London. She leaves there. She walks down to the bus stop there at Camden or Chalk Farm, I think it was, and she's waiting at the bus stop. And another young lady comes up who's got a pizza hot pizza in a box, begins to open the box and eat the pizza. And so this woman who I've been working with, I'm training her just to respond to whatever's around her like a child. She just goes, wow, that smells lovely. And this other girl goes, oh, do you want some? She goes, yeah, I'd love some. And so these two are chatting there, and they sit on the bus, and she chats and eats pizza with this person she's just met. And from there, she realizes, and she just begins to open out about everything with everything. And her whole professional life moves off into a whole direction. I saw her 2 years later. She's become director of creative director at this whole agency. I mean, she did go and do a yoga teacher training as well. But it just one little step, she discovers, oh, this is how it works. And suddenly, instead of going around in your head with like stories about, I wonder why she's eating that pizza, and the little stories inside our heads, we actually discover we actually have some mastery in our environment. We can express ourselves and influence our environment. In this case, having a wonderful connection with another person who you've just met. And once you start to do that, you realize you can open out with people, and that people love this. This is how we have community. This is how we get rid of loneliness. And connectedness. I think this theme of connectedness is so important. There's a BBC documentary of when Baba Muktananda came to England, and there's a psychologist interviewed on it, American psychologist, a young black American psychologist. He said, the one thing I see is after this Shaktipat, what I see with my patients is they're more connected. And the problem with mental health is fundamentally disconnection. And I was just talking with our clinical psychologist, Dr. Chrissy Ivings, on this. She said that's such an interesting lens to look at everything from, is connectedness.
Yeah.
Connectedness. So if people are feeling more connected to their community, to their family, they walk down the road feels like home because they feel connected, they express. Yeah.
Do you have a tip or trick for becoming more disinhibited, or is it just to take that plunge and just start opening your mouth and saying what's on your mind or what you're feeling or what you're noticing? Is it just to get over that hump, or is there any other little tip or trick?
Yeah. Act as if constantly half drunk.
That's a good one.
That's a good one, because most of the people listening here know what it's like to have a glass or two of wine. Once you have a glass or two of wine or beer or whatever your thing is, in vino veritas, the truth comes out. I mean, instead of going, I think we should do this, you go, you know what, I think we should, and your body is involved, the emotions are moving through the body, everything's expressed spontaneously. That's why people like to drink. It fundamentally is disinhibition. Yeah, Salter calls people, inhibited people are emotionally constipated, and alcohol is their laxative.
Yeah.
So practicing that, and it's really interesting to go and practice that. What's that like? Well, that means just expressing, and also I like this idea of doing a sort of, Salter calls it an improvisation at the piano of the senses. Walk down the street and go, how does the air feel in my lungs? How do my feet feel in my shoes? How does that color feel to me? How does that feel to me? First, notice that. So have this sort of improvisation. Notice how things, not notice them, but notice how they feel to you. And then, because everything creates a feeling tone in you. Everything creates a response in you. And then express that and talk to and then open out to people and say to them, and just begin talking with strangers is the easiest way, if you will, but you could do it with friends and family too. But this idea of just opening out when you're checking out the supermarket and you just notice something, you say, oh, that brooch is lovely, or whatever it is, whatever strikes you, say it immediately. Don't hesitate. Just say it.
Yeah.
And as soon as you start to do that, just like this girl did at the bus stop, your whole world will change.
Yeah, it's like it opens up and becomes more vivid too.
Well, I think that's really interesting in terms of, I think, people talk about being in contact with the present moment, but in contact and notice and then expressing your response to begins to put you, it's like you become more embedded into the present moment in a juicy way.
Yeah. You're part of life instead of a spectator. And as much as our culture loves watching screens, we're actually profoundly dissatisfied with merely being spectators.
Well, I think that concept of dissatisfaction, essentially with our performances socially or whatever, is profoundly worth looking at, because I think that so much of that comes from not feeling, again, it's agency. That I can express, that I can do something here. And as you begin to express yourself, you realize you have agency. All of that work was the forerunner of assertiveness training, which I think is super important. Because as people begin to express, go on.
Well, let's come to agency just in the time we have left, because it's an important topic. We're not going to cover it fully. And, in our various sparring matches on social media, which it's always funny, right? Because I think there's people in the Facebook group or wherever that might think we hate each other or something, but we're actually friends. But I think just the nature of that medium, and it means that there seems to be a much bigger disagreement than there actually is. So if I just briefly state my perspective. You can respond to the reality of it instead of the caricature, right? Because it's a complex topic, but to simplify it to the essentials, what I'm saying and what I think the tradition is saying is that you don't have control over almost anything. You can have control over very, very, very little. Like you can't choose what emotion you're going to feel next. You can't choose what thought's going to come to you before it comes, right? You can't choose your programming. It's already in there, right? You can't choose what happens to you. You can't choose your karma. And yet, at the same time, you do have agency because one of the most important features of agency is where you put your attention. And where you put your attention over and over again shapes your experience quite profoundly. And of course, you can learn to reframe. You can learn, oh, I've been framing things this way, and it's unhealthy, and it makes me feel terrible. But I can take account of the evidence just as well or better with this frame, and that frame makes me feel empowered. So you can learn the reframing and start to do the reframing, and that's all within your agency. So I completely agree with you that there can be radical transformation in people's life experience, in the way they're experiencing their day-to-day reality, and that is within their power, especially if they're getting the right support, right? It's within our power to make those changes, and so that is agency, right? But I do see value to the teaching that you're not in control, because it allows you to let go of your futile attempts to magically influence reality, law of attraction, manifestation. I'm going to make the money show up in my life that's on its way to me from wherever it is now. I don't have to do anything. I just keep imagining it. They stop wasting time with that and start putting their attention on that which they can do. And that makes a huge difference, right? And it would be bad, lastly, if we tried to control our emotions, tried to dictate to our body, this is the emotion that is allowed to arise and the others are not allowed. That would be unhealthy for us. So it's good for us to acknowledge, oh, I'm not in control of what I feel. I'm not in control of what I desire or who I desire. And that's okay, because I'm not a slave to the desires. I could choose to put my attention on this desire and not that one. It's okay that it's there, but I'm not going to attend to it in the same way. And in that way, I shape my experience. So that's a kind of, however brief, at least a little bit more nuanced statement of my view on the matter. So if you want to respond to that and completely reject anything I said, it's fine with me.
Well, I think, it's good. I understand your points there, and let's come back and have a look. First, I think we need to set aside the discussion of free will, which is just a philosopher's and jurisprudence game. It's got no relevance. There's no such thing as, it's just a concept. What we're interesting is
it's bad language.
It's bad. There's a thing called freedom. There's no essences like that. So what we have is the concept of, do I have a choice and agency? Yeah. So, and what you've said there is, one, we do have a choice where we can place our attention. So we have agency. We have agency. We have agency there, and in some ways, I would say all we have is our spotlight of attention. We could talk about that's worthy of a whole thing in itself. The whole spotlight of attention discussion. So I approach it like this in terms of, when you look at main themes in psychology, in therapy, but in psychology as well, one of the overarching themes that comes through is the concept of self-efficacy, developed by the great psychologist Albert Bandura. So self-efficacy means the exercise of self-control. Yeah. And he maps out and self-efficacy beliefs, the belief that you can influence the situation, determines outcomes in education, in careers, in health, in therapy, aging, relationships, all sorts of things. If you think you're helpless, you're just it's not helpful. And so Bandura's concepts on self-efficacy, I would say, are probably the strongest kind of concept running through our training course. And I recently had somebody who's take the training course who's a yoga teacher and a non-dual student of another non-dual teacher, and suffers with lots of bouts of depression and things like that. And she said, oh my God, she goes, this teaching on self-efficacy, I realize I can do something. I can do something. So Bandura maps out people who have high belief in their abilities to do things, self-belief. This isn't self-esteem, self-belief, my ability to do things. Bandura says, I can nearly give you the quote, they set themselves challenging goals and then maintain their efforts towards them. When they meet with difficulties, they keep up their efforts. When they meet with failure, they don't put failure, they put failure down to insufficient knowledge, practice, or effort, all of things are which are acquirable and changeable. They do not suffer from depression generally, yeah? People with low self-efficacy, not low self-esteem, low belief in their abilities, avoid challenging goals which they see as personal threats. They focus on all of the obstacles they will face rather than focusing what needs to be done. When they meet with failure, they put it down to something wrong with themselves rather than something that can be changed. Does that make sense? And so they don't bounce back easily from failure. I think this is such a powerful, this is like rocket fuel to understand this. Yeah. So Bandura then maps out what are the steps to self-efficacy, and he maps them out very clearly. There are 4 steps to self-efficacy. The first is self-regulation. And this means being able to self-regulate attention and emotion. If you cannot, and I disagree with you here in terms of saying, if you can't regulate your emotions, you are at the mercy of the stimuli and your conditioned reflexes, right? And your past. So emotional self-regulation is fundamental. This begins in childhood. The child learns to regulate their emotions. They don't just respond impulsively as they do when they're very young. They begin to be able to control themselves and regulate. And they go, if you set the table, we'll go to the zoo tomorrow. Okay. Instead of going off playing with their toys, they have the impulse to play with their toys.
Wait a second, because this is important. I have a problem with terminology, because in the example you gave, that's about self-control of behavior. And so where is the regulation of emotions? Do you mean just choosing what you act on and how you act on it? Because that's about behavior, not emotion.
Yeah. No, well, it's that they're not giving in to the impulses that are coming up. And also you learn that you can calm yourself down. So, the first thing we teach clients is self-regulation of emotion. That's the first thing. Because if they can't regulate their emotion down, if they can't go and learn some method of emotional self-regulation, they feel it's the first sense, oh my gosh, I can control this. Yes, you can control it. So they self-regulation.
Okay, so wait a second though. Maybe this is just language. So does regulation of emotion just mean I can calm down? I have tools to calm down, and it's good to calm down, and I do it now. Is that all you mean by regulation of emotion?
No, I mean more than that, because everything is about getting something done. Yeah, we're not sitting around we're doing things. So we have emotions come up. We're no longer able to continue the conversation or focus on the task or get the point across in the meeting or write the email. So we can calm our emotions down and we can focus our attention and accomplish the task at hand. Similarly with the child, they're suddenly excited to play with their toys, but they remember, if I set the table, I'll go to the zoo tomorrow. They're able to keep in mind something they want here, not give in to the impulses here, focus on the task at hand here, regulate attention and emotion. Attention and emotion are going to regulate together. So we want to bring those. So that's the first. That's if you don't have that, you're just a puppet. You're just being jerked around. So, but if you look at, it's worth looking at child development to look at basically, animals and young children are not able to self-regulate much, right? And the ability to self-regulate, which comes from language, and imagination and the development of the imagination. I can go to the zoo tomorrow. The word zoo triggers the potential. I can see the tiger in bed. Okay, I'll go and tidy my room. So the child can talk to themselves, self-regulate their attention. Even though they want to play with their toys, they're going to put their toys away so they can go to the zoo tomorrow. And they can, in their imagination, they can motivate themselves because they can see what they could do. Does that make sense? Now,
Yes,
they're no longer bound by the present moment. Language allows them to no longer be bound by present moment stimuli.
okay, but I just want to clearly distinguish between behavior and emotion, right? So self-regulation in terms of behavior, I have no problem with that, right? That's in a way what makes us human. If we don't embrace that, we're not embracing our humanity. But self-regulation of emotion is, there's where I see the problem. For example, I think it's great to have the skills to be able to calm yourself down, right? But for many people who don't have, who haven't gone through your training, right? When they calm themselves down, they are suppressing what they authentically feel. They're, instead of looking at it, instead of learning from it, instead of like understanding where's that coming from, they're suppressing it, and then it bursts out in another moment, like that tube of toothpaste squeezed too hard. So how do you talk about regulating emotion without giving this implicit pretext for suppression and control in this way?
I mean, I have to say, I think this is a bit of I don't know what would be the right word for it. Boondock. I mean, it's just I never come across that with my clients, and I've worked with thousands of clients, so they know this is not the way. They learn that they can self-regulate. They learn that they can calm themselves down a bit, not complete, but they can calm themselves down a bit. And now we might tie in the salter stuff. We want to, but if the emotions are too high, they're not going to, it's like the engine's revving too high to put the power down. Let's calm it down a bit. We still want to notice what we're feeling there. Is that important? Is that useful? But while the client feels out of control, usually lack of emotional awareness, first thing is emotional awareness. Yeah. So awareness, being able to actually label and communicate. The inability to do that is extremely problematic. It's called alexithymia, when somebody has no language for emotion. So language will help regulate. Language is the first thing. So when you work with, one of the things, if you're working with children as well, you're going to teach them how to label their emotions so they can communicate about their emotions. Language regulates attention. It will regulate emotion. So being able to say, I'm feeling sad, actually will down-regulate, but also the child has language. Language is power. I think you know that one. So, so this is so emotional awareness, emotional tolerance, being able to accept the emotions. So you're not reactive regulating. You're just going, okay, I can reduce particularly some of the tension in the body right now. Now that's interesting because reducing the tension in the musculature, which is one of the fundamental things, reduces your reactivity. Reactivity is based on the musculature. So if the muscles are completely relaxed, we're back to Jacobson's incredible work. There's no reflexes to the environment. There's no responses. Nothing. So all of your reflex responses to the environment are mediated by how tense you are, essentially. So learning to reduce that means you have more creative control now. You can set things off in the direction you want rather than feel, yeah. So I'll put an essay. I have an essay in the works on 7 types of freedom, but this is one of the types of freedom, is learning how to, essentially you could relax all your muscles so you have no response to anything at all, but you wouldn't do anything then, but it's peaceful.
Yeah.
But
And
does that make sense?
Yes. People these days in the spiritual communities are differentiating the term react and respond. So they're saying, reaction is your conditioned response, and respond, that's when you're coming from the heart or coming from a deeper place. And of course, that's not standard usage. It's just within specific communities. But that's kind of what you're talking about.
That's okay. You were talking about something more choiceful, though. When we say with something about we're choosing to respond from a deeper place that's more aligned, is going to be more, and ultimately will be more effective or more harmonious, whatever that principle is that's governing that. But we're making a more choiceful response. And some people are going to say, well, that flies in the face of Salter's immediacy. I said, yes, that's an interesting thing here. But first, let's just to run through Bandura. So the 4 steps to agency. 1, self-regulation, particularly emotional self-regulation and attention regulation. 2nd, knowing what to do, verbal instruction. So, and that could also be self-talk. Do this, do this, do this. Self-talk regulates, again, attention. So knowing what to do. The 3rd step, and this was Bandura's unique contribution, was vicarious learning. So we learn by observing others. So he's the guy that did the Bobo doll experiments where, the children watched adults beating up a doll and the children went and beat up the doll, and you must have.
Yeah.
So the idea that we learn automatically, both consciously and I think we increasingly recognize unconsciously, by observing others. Not just by observing others. We learn by hearing stories of others. We learn also by role play. And also in our imagination. So these are vicarious ways of learning, as if you're there learning. Does that make sense? As if you're there learning. Hypothetical behavior.
Using mirror neurons, for example.
Well, you could think about mirror neurons, but also let me give an example. If, we want clients to be open and tell us what's working in therapy, and you can say to the client, it's really important you tell me if something's not working, then we can fine tune things. But my colleague, Don Meichenbaum, who's on our advisory board, in his book on stress inoculation training, gives the example of using a hypothetical client saying, look, I once had a client and things were going very well. Well, I thought they were going well. But it turned out about the fourth or fifth session, they wanted to quit therapy. And I said, well, why? And they go, well, it hasn't been working at all. And they hadn't been telling me at all what we're discussing hadn't been working at all. So I said, look, just give me a couple more sessions and do radical honesty with me. Just tell me what you like, what you don't like, what's working. And as soon as that happened, things took off. We were able to work and we made such great change. So I tell a story. As I tell the story, the client imagines themselves into that story. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's a better way of learning than verbal instruction.
Yes, that's a great point.
But the final stage is real life coping in life, mastery and coping in real life. Nothing is more powerful than actually going out into real life and having an experience of being able to do that.
Name again for me the third, because it didn't quite click in my brain.
So we've got self-regulation, verbal instruction, knowing what to do, vicarious learning, observing others' imagination, etc. And then the fourth is real life experiences of coping and mastery, which are going to be more powerful than anything else. Right. Nothing is more powerful than clients outside the therapy room having experiences of coping and mastery, where before they didn't have that. That will update their whole system at a very deep level.
Okay, we don't have too much time left, but let me just throw this out there. This is something you hear in some of these current spiritual communities, yoga-influenced communities, and so on these days. To what extent do you agree or disagree, and why, with this statement? You need to feel your feelings fully.
You need to express your feelings fully. So feeling them is doing what? It's expressing them. In other words, we need to reconnect the autonomic nervous system and the motor system, the behavioral system. That schism between them is the problem. So for me in therapy isn't clients learning to talk about their feelings. It's about them learning to talk with feeling.
This is super important, Mark, because what I'm seeing in some of these spaces is the people are being told you need to feel your feelings fully, and what you can do is you can express them by just screaming and crying in the safe container of the place. And then we all go to lunch and we are all nice to each other. We all speak, oh, it's so wonderful to be here with you, whatever. In other words, not fully authentic interpersonal relating, and the emotion is only expressed in this non-verbal vocalization. It seems to me that something's really not working with that paradigm. Let me give you
a 1-minute example of how I work with somebody, like a young lady. Her boyfriend's been rude to her about her weight. Some of these boyfriends send awful things. How they put, I don't know, So she's low assertiveness, etc. She's not expressing herself. So I said, well, what would you like to say to him? Let's pretend I'm on the phone with you. We'll role play. What do you like? Well, that was really not nice what you said. I fucking come on. Well, no, it was really not fair what you said. And I said, come on in here. Just tell me, what do you want to say to him? You fucking bastard. Don't you fucking say that again. That's so painful. And I said, fantastic. Now you know what you feel. And you've unlocked that feeling fully into expression with this person. But this is just role play here. Now you know fully what you feel. What do you want to say to him? Don't you ever say that again. Boom. she's in touch with her emotion and she's able to regulate it in an effective way and use it to guide her behavior. So this is an example.
Yeah, no, this is a great example. So she, in the safe space with you, she expresses it in this unregulated way, this explosion of profanity or whatever.
Not into the universe, as role play with me as the boyfriend.
Exactly. And so there, and then she's able to express it in a more regulated way that has the power of that emotional expressiveness, but is something that is going to be more effective in its language than just a messy explosion of expletives or whatever.
Exactly. And we might go further and say, now let's find 5 different ways to express that. I.e., don't put up with shit, Sally. I want you, whether you'd go, why? You could tease him, you could charm him, you could be cold, you could be direct, you could be really forceful. I want her to have a whole range of behavioral options. Now, what happens now, something that's worth talking about, is when she comes to situations now, she is going to have an immediate sense of different affordances. Affordances comes from perceptual psychology, what you immediately precognitively sense you can do in that situation. When you see a set of steps, that gives you a behavioral affordance. Precognitively, you can walk up the steps. Everything is based on behaviors before thought, right? So animal are constantly this sense of what is afforded you, possible for you in that environment immediately, yeah? If you got tiny legs, the set of steps wouldn't give you the behavioral affordance of going up because they look too big. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. As we expanded her sense of behavioral options, her sense of social behavioral affordances, what she can do in situations, has automatically shifted. Does that make sense? Precognitively, new possibilities will be there for her.
Yeah.
Agency.
Yeah, and you can only, and here's what we agree on, I think, you can only choose amongst the options that you perceive yourself as having. And so when you broaden that palette of options, then that's good for you because that's what you're choosing amongst.
As you came back earlier, and as you intimated earlier, the more you practice regulation attention here and here, the more actual choice and agency you begin to have. So what I want to really look at is this concept of graduated agency all through up right to the top. And I want to propose this idea that the cognitive insight in, for example, prajnabinya is not one of ontological truth. It is one of agency. The insight in prajnabinya is not one of ontological truth. It is agency.
Well, the agency is right there in the first sutra. The chitti is swatantra.
I think the avoidance of discussions of agency is because of trying to fit in with the Neo-Advaita Vedantins and the Buddhists, because they can't deal with that idea. This is Kashmir Shaivism. Agency is what makes the difference. For Tantriya Shakti is what makes the difference.
Yes, I absolutely agree. And the thing we need to discuss more at another time, right, is just the fact that it's not personal, right? That the ego makes it so personal. My agency, your agency is the universe's agency. But yes, the tradition has an enormous emphasis on agency. It just doesn't make it mine versus yours. And I think that's good, and we can discuss it.
Well, it's not somebody else's either, though. I mean, you are the one that's regulating your attention. So this sense of I-ness...
No, but I mean to say we all have the same agency, the same power of agency, right? As opposed to some hierarchy where I have more and you have less, and therefore I can oppress you or whatever. Okay, we'll circle back to that. We need to have another call for sure. There's much more to discuss, but
because I'm sure people are wondering, what is this hypnosis thing, and how does that fit into everything? And that is a juicy discussion.
Yes, and we'll discuss it next time. But I'll just briefly mention, for those who don't understand, yes, like Mark discovered, there is therapeutic hypnosis, which is nothing like stage hypnosis, nothing like mentalism. And it's a real discipline, and it has evidence, and it's evidence-based. And we'll talk about that next time.
And I would take that all the way through into us all being hypnotized by our own suggestions and into the ideas of being possessed or hypnotized by certain ideas, into the Abhinavagupta's concepts on possession.
All the time. Everyone's walking around hypnotized.
and then the process of dehypnosis,
Yes.
and then strategic hypnosis around Shuddha-vidya. So
yes.
Do you
Exactly.
get that? So,
that's a fascinating thing. Yeah, hypnosis is really, when it's working, is dehypnosis, actually.
well, there is no, but Shuddha-vidya, contemplating, that bhavana on the thought. When Mark Jaskowski saw the book I was reading, the imagination, the narrative construction of reality, he then spontaneously gave this lecture for 90 minutes on the use of the imagination in Shaktopaya, and this is something worthy of discussion, because I will propose the final thought that imagination is the only route to freedom. The running of new simulations of possibilities, the simulated possibilities we run in our imagination is the only way we change actually the conditioning. Otherwise, we're just going to repeat. And that, I think, lines up very strongly with the whole predictive processing theories.
Okay, well, that's another thing we need to discuss more next time. Because I have some thoughts about that. But let me just try to summarize where we got to in the end there, because I think it's hugely important for many of the people that might be listening to this, if they made it to the end, that if I can summarize this way, your emotions are not essences that define your character, right? That they are potential guides to behavior. If we say they need to be felt, it's more useful to shift that to they need to be expressed, because they're not essences in themselves. They are prompts, and we are innately social creatures, right? And so even if we express unskillfully, we learn by expressing, and we learn from the feedback loop, and we need tools like you're offering people, Mark, and that just somatically experiencing your emotion is insufficient, and it assumes this implicit view of essentialism, that these are like energies essential to my being, and that needs to be questioned. Is that right?
Yes, and also, I mean, that things happen in context with behavior. I mean, in the real world, not in. Do you see what I mean? So emotions are there to organize behavior in the real world as we try and get things done that we need to get done. We need to pay our bills. We need to call a plumber. We need to, and deal with the neighbor.
But we also need to feel connected to other human beings, or else we feel not. Right with ourselves.
What I would say is the expression of immediate emotion will make us feel more connected. We'll go, and that's how we rebuild community. That's how we overcome loneliness. Is not by being cooped up and having and also trying to control the emotions inside. No, you can calm them down a bit, but then express them.
Good. As I suspected, we agree on much more than we disagree on, and there are interesting details to pick apart, and we'll have to have a second conversation. So for now, I'll just say thank you very much for your brilliant insight, your commitment to truth, and being of service to humanity and seeing our potential for freedom and happiness. Thank you, Mark.
Well, I want to thank you for all your great work as well. It's amazing. And all this group of scholars that have done this, scholar practitioners that have done this work, that have helped land those. We had those few texts, and now we have so much more, and it's just fantastic. And so, how you've managed to do that, the agency behind that's we should just.
Yeah, another thing to explore. Okay, thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga practices, guided meditations, and much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Paula Chamas. New episodes drop every other week. And may all beings benefit.